Hello everyone, and we meet once again. Welcome to all our viewers on another short video on Ask the Experts, where we take you through a very rewarding for the most trending and the most searched queries online pertaining to the cybersecurity industry. And in this, we take up all the questions asked by viewers, clients, and what you have seen in our assignments that you do in the industry. And also, many of those questions are something that our viewers have posted on our YouTube channel. So in today's video, we are continuing with PCI DSS requirements, summary of changes from version 3.2.1 to 4.0. And today we are covering PCI DSS requirement 8. And in case you have not seen the previous requirements 1 to 7, you should see it. You can see the playlist description in the description of this video. You can go into it. And before we head on to a topic, hope you have subscribed to our channel. This is a treasure trove of information on various standards, compliance, governance, and various cybersecurity issue areas. And our YouTube channel is probably the most visited compliance channel on YouTube. This is not really a figure of speech. You can check it out yourself. All the content is free, and I really hope that you can make the most of it. So click on the subscribe button, click on the bell icon, and we go ahead. So today, as we are covering requirement 8, this is a really long requirement, many changes. I'll try and summarize it as much as possible, but this will be slightly more taxing on you. And so stay tuned with me, drop in your queries in the comments as you move along. All right. So heading straight. So requirement 8 of PCI DSS 3.2.1, this is to identify and authenticate access to system components. And the name has changed in version 4 to identify users and authenticate access to system components. So the word users have been added, been more specific, right? So the overview of, if I look at it from the overview perspective of PCI DSS 4, it suggests two fundamental principles for identifying and authenticating users. So the first is the identification establishment, which is establishing the identity of any individual or process on a computer system. Typically, you call it as a user ID. And the next part is whomsoever has claimed to be that user, prove or verify the user associated with the identity of who the user claims to be. This is typically the password or the token that could be in place. So this is what access management is all about identification, authentication, and of course there is an authorizing factor also, but that depends on the authentication. So this requirement has standardized on terms authentication factor and authentication credentials. So in this latest requirement, they have removed the non-consumer users and they've clarified in the review that this requirement doesn't apply to accounts used by customers or the cardholders. So this is when in PCI DSS, this is one of the most frequently asked questions. So when we say, for example, review of user rights, many of the banks that we have as clients or even payment gateways who are our clients, they say, does it mean even the millions of users who have a cardholder data, because even they have IDs on the system? No, those are the individual accounts consumers or cardholders. They are not covered in the purview of this requirement. And if you ask then what is the meaning of non-consumer users, PCI DSS defines non-consumer users as individuals who access system components but are not cardholders, such as the employees, administrators, and third parties working for this entity that is being assessed, right? So they have removed the note in the overview. In earlier, that is 3.2.1, the listed requirements they have put down over there that this does not apply to user accounts with access to only one cardholder data at a time to facilitate a single direction, and they that note to each related requirement. Now, what does it mean? Earlier in version 3.2.1, this particular exception was written in the overview of requirement 8. But now it is written wherever applicable in requirement 8. And what does this mean? I'll just say it once so you'll know. Basically speaking, let me give an example for you to understand. So you go to a Walmart or you go to Cosby's or whatever be the case, or Star Bazaar or whatever, to buy something, and you give your card at the checkout counter. So that person over there is handling only one card data at a time. So these access control requirements, wherever the exception is provided, doesn't apply to the person who is at the checkout counter. So those are not in the purview. of this requirement, of only this requirement under requirement 8. There are requirements under requirement 9 where even those checkout counters are applicable and the POS devices are applicable, but for the requirements under requirement 8, they are not applicable. So let's jump right in. So the earlier requirement 8.1 of PCI DSS 321 mentions about defining and implementing policies and procedures to ensure proper user identification management for non-consumer users and administrators for all card components. Now, this is overall getting covered in requirement 8.1.1 of PCI DSS 4. And this mentions that all security policies and procedures, operational procedures that are identified in requirement 8 are documented, kept up to date, in use, and known to all affected parties. Now, this requirement 8.1.1 also in the earlier version speaks about assigning all users a unique ID before allowing them access to system components or cardholder data. Now, this is now covered in 8.2.1 in PCI DSS 4, which also talks about the same requirement. And the latest PCI DSS 4 requirement 8.2.1v also added a note that this requirement is not intended to apply to user accounts on the point of sale terminals that have access to only one card holder data at a time and facilitates only one card transaction. So even those people on the helpline or in the online portals where they are sitting to accept your calls and take an order, even they are not coming in the view. So it's not just the card present transactions, even the card not present transactions, this exception is applicable. Now, moving on to the next requirement, which is requirement 8.1.2 of PCI DSS 321. This mentions about control, addition, deletion, and modifications of user IDs and credentials and other objects. And this is rather covered or addressed in the latest version under requirement 8.2.4. So there's been a shift. And 8.2.4 of PCI 4 mentions the addition, deletion, and modifications of user IDs, authentication factors, and other identified objects are managed as follows. So they are given two possibilities over there. One, authorized with the appropriate approval, and the next is implemented with only the privileges specified on the documented approval. Nothing more, nothing less. Right? The next is this applicable note for requirement 8.2.4 also states that this requirement applies to all user accounts, including employees, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, and even third party vendors. Now, this is a welcome change because earlier this clarity was not there. So, some companies would actually say, no, it only speaks about internal users, the third party vendors are not in scope, or contractors are not in scope. But in this latest version of PCI, version 4, this clarity has been maintained. Now, the next requirement, 8.1.4 of PCI DSS version 3.2.1, it mentions to remove or disable inactive user accounts within 90 days. And this is now covered in requirement 8.2.6, which mentions inactive user accounts that are removed or disabled within 90 days of inactivity. The same thing, just the requirement numbers have changed. Now, PCI DSS, the earlier version 3.2.1 requirement 8.1.5, this mentions about managing IDs used by third parties to access, support, or maintain system components via remote access that are enabled only during the time period needed and disabled when not in use, and then further monitored when in use. So now in version 4, this is now covered under requirement 8.2.7. And here it mentions that the accounts used by third parties to access, support, or maintain system components via remote access are managed, and they made it more clear. Number one, enabled only during the time period needed and disabled when not in use. And the next is use is monitored for unexpected activity. So there is in this component doesn't speak anything new. It was literally like common sense. But I'm glad that the council has put it because there would be pushback from clients who don't want to understand or accept the in spirit, intention of this requirement. So I'm glad that the council has added this clarity. So use is monitored for unexpected activities. So earlier, what would happen is clients would say that under 3.2.1, this requirement only speaks about monitored when in use. So they'll say, oh, we are logging it. But if you're logging it, then who's monitoring those logs? Because those are outside users. So that is where version 4 speaks about use is monitored for unexpected activity. So that means that you have to keep it under constant monitoring. Now, coming to the next thing, requirement 8.1.6 and requirement 8.1.7 both speak about limiting repeated access attempts by locking out user IDs after not more than 6 attempts and setting the lockout duration to period to a minimum 30 minutes or until an administrator enables the user IDs are now these are both merged. Both these requirements 8.1.6 and 1.7 are both merged and addressed together in requirement 8.3.4 of PCI 4. Now this requirement speaks about invalid authentication attempts are limited by number one, locking out the user ID after not more than 10 attempts. Earlier it was 6, now it is made 10. So there has been an increase from 6 to 10. And then the setting the lockout duration to minimum of 30 minutes or until the user's identity is confirmed. So the same thing which is carried forward from the earlier version. Now again, this does not apply to single card usage terminals like a point of sale terminal. The same exception that I had mentioned earlier. Now coming to the next requirement, 8.1.8 of PCI DSS 3.2.1. This mentions that if a session is idle for more than 15 minutes, it would require the user to re-authenticate to reactivate the terminal or the session. Now this is covered in requirement 8.2.8 of version 4 of PCI DSS. Now, this requirement, this modified requirement 8.2.8 also mentions that if a user session has been idle for more than 15 minutes, the user is required to re-authenticate and reactivate the terminal or the session. And it further adds that the requirement is not intended to apply to user accounts of point of sale terminals that facilitate only one card at a time. The same exception that we discussed earlier. Now the next is the requirement 8.2 of PCI DSS 3.2.1. Now this mentions that in addition to assigning a unique ID, ensure proper user authentication management for non-consumer users and administrators on all system components by applying at least one of the following methods to authenticate the users. So now this is applicable to non-consumer users. You've already seen the definition, and administrators. So there are three, at least one you have to use. So that there are three possibilities. Something you know, something like password or a passphrase. Something you have, which could be like a token device or a smart card, or even like a an app on your phone. Even that is qualifies. And the third is a biometric. So what you know, what you have, and what you are. These are the three terminologies used in multi-factor authentication. So you have to use at least two of these. You cannot say, I am repeating this very clearly. Please make a note. You cannot have two passwords and say this is a multi-factor. No. Multi-factor means you have to have two of these three, not two of one. You cannot have two tokens being sent to one phone and that will qualify as acceptable. No, you have to have at least two of these factors in place. Now, the same requirement is covered in the latest version of PCI DSS 4 under requirement 3.2.1. And the same thing is mentioned over here that all users and administrators are authenticated via at least one of these authentication factors. And again, this requirement 8.3.1 of PCI 4, again, not applicable to point of sale terminal. Now, moving on to the next requirement, which is PCI DSS 3.2.1, the older version requirement 8.2.1. This mentions about using strong cryptography to render all authentication credentials unreadable during transmission and storage on all system components. Covering the same aspects of requirement 8.2.1 of PCI DSS 3.2.1, it is covered under 8.3.2 of PCI DSS 4. And it mentions the same thing, strong cryptography to render all authentication factors unreadable during transmission and storage on all components. Now, next is requirement 8.2.2 of the older PCI DSS 3.2.1. And this speaks about verifying user identity before modifying any authentication credentials. For example, password reset or giving new tokens or generating new keys. So it's saying you have to verify the user identity again before modifying any authentication. And this is covered again in requirement 8.3.3 of version 4, which simply says that verify user identity before modifying any authentication factors. Now, 8.3.3, let me get into details of PCI DSS 4, also mentions about the good practice that modification to authentication factors for which identity should be verified include but are not limited to performing password resets, provision of new tokens, and generating new keys. So, it has made the scope more expansive based on the interpretation of the risk of your environment. And then we have requirement 8.2.3 of PCI, the older version. It speaks about the criterion for passwords and passphrases, and it also speaks about the complexity for the passwords and passphrases, at least equivalent to these parameters. So covering the same aspect of the requirement, but updating this requirement with more changes is requirement 8.3.6. In my opinion, this is one of the most crucial changes in PCI DSS 4. And this mentions that if passwords or passphrases are used as authentication factors to meet the requirement of 8.3.1, they must meet the minimum level of complexity. And over here, the minimum length has changed from 7 to 12 characters. And there is a writer over here that if the system doesn't support 12 characters, a minimum length of 8 characters has to be done. And this contains both numeric and alphabetic, right? So the update which is there in 8.3.6 is increasing the password length from 7 characters to 12 characters. Now, this is going to be a massive change to all the applications and the systems which are there. So you need to start working and cracking on it right away. The only grace that I can show you, depending on when you're watching this video, is that this thing becomes mandatory not until 31st March 2025. So in case you're seeing this requirement now, you're already too late. You need to get working on it right away. Now, it is also clarified in version 4 that this requirement applies only if passwords or passphrases are used as an authentication factor to meet 8.3.1. And then the usual, exception that it does not apply to point of sale terminals. So the requirement 8.2.4 of version 3.2.1, that's the older version, mentions about the change in user passwords, passphrases at least every 90 days. And this same thing is covered in requirement 8.3.9 of version 4 with some clarification. Here it mentions that this is applicable only if passwords and passphrases are used as an authentication factor for user access in case of a single factor authentication implementation, that is. So in case your system is using maybe biometric for access to an application or a token for access to an application, so then this requirement won't apply. So only if your application is using passwords and passphrases as an authentication factor, then only this requirement, which is 8.3.9 of version 4, are applicable. Furthermore, this PCI 4 also mentions in the applicability note that the requirement applies to only in-scope system components that are not in the CDE, because these systems are not subject to the multi-factor requirements. So this thing sometimes it's in scope, but it's not a part of it could be a part of a vendor environment or a part of some third-party environment. Now, in addition, the same exception, that is, this is not intended to apply for user accounts for point of sale terminals. And this requirement also does not apply to service providers customer account, but applies to all the non-consumer users. Service provider customer accounts would also be the cardholder data accounts, right? And also could be applicable to, so for example, I'm a payment gateway provider and I have my clients logging into my portal. So it could be some bank, it could be some merchant, or it could be some biller. They're logging on to my payment gateway for doing whatever they are doing. So those classify as a service provider customer account. So this requirement does not apply to them. Now PCI DSS requirement 8.2.5 of the earlier version mentions about not allowing an individual to submit a new password or passphrase that is the same as the last 4 passphrases that has been used. So this is like the password history. So the requirement as this is shifted from 8.2.5 to 8.3.7. But they've added an applicability note, which is the same like the rider that I've said earlier. It does not apply to user accounts and point of sale terminals working on one card at a time. Now, moving on to the next requirement, which is requirement 8.2.6 of the earlier version. This mentions about setting passwords or passphrases for first-time users and upon reset to a unique value for each user and change immediately after first use. And this requirement is now addressed in 8.3.5, but again, it clarifies that this requirement applies only and only if passwords and passphrases are used as an authentication factor to meet the requirement 8.3.1 of PCI DSS 4. Now, this requirement 8.3.5 states that to meet requirement 8.3.1, they are set and reset for each user as follows, and there are the two conditions. Number one, set to a unique value for first time use and upon reset, and then forced to change immediately after first use. So they cannot use the same temporary password assigned. They are forced to use a new one. Next, in the earlier version, requirement 8.3, it mentions about securing all individual non-console administrative access and all remote access to the CD using multi-factor authentication. Now, this requirement has been removed in PCI DSS 4, and because this requirement is now distributed across multiple requirement, and a new requirement has been introduced in the latest PCI 4, and this is requirement 8.4.2 that mentions implementing MFA, multi-factor authentication, for all access to the CD. It doesn't give any, it gets into the details or whatever be the case, but it makes it blanket. You need to have multi-factor authentication for all access to the CD. So earlier, because of the complex language in 321, there were some companies who would find some way to slither below the requirements and not have multi-factor authentication. So I'm very glad that the PCI has come up with a clarification. In PCI 4 for 8.4.2, there's a note for clarification which mentions and clarifies that MFA is required for both types of access specified in requirement 8.4.2 and 8.4.3, and that applying MFA to one type of access does not replace the need to apply another instance of MFA to other types of access. So this new requirement 8.5.1, which is introduced in PCI 4, mentions about secure implementation of multi-factor authentication systems. And this requirement is a best practice until 31st March 2025. This will again require a lot of overhaul for many companies, lot of investment of time and money. So I really hope you guys have started, because there is no hope beyond 31st March 2025. Now, this new requirement that I just mentioned, 8.5.1, speaks about MFA systems and gives a brilliant and very beautiful clarity. So it says that whatever this MFA is should not be susceptible to replay attack, which is like somebody using the same token and using it again. So it literally has to be a one time user only. Sometimes there is the OTP that is that expires after 1 hour. So that OTP, even though the full form is one-time password, can be used n number of times within 1 hour. So that thing is not applicable, is not acceptable. And the MFA cannot be bypassed by any users, including administrative users, unless specifically documented and authorized by management on exception basis for a limited period. So no bypass for anybody for any circumstance. If there is, there has to be some sort of a documentation and approval chain in place. And at least two types of authentication factors. So one authentication factor being used twice is not acceptable. And then success of all the factors is required before access is granted. So it cannot be that you have two factors, or the password has worked but the token has not worked and you've given access. No, both have to be working and acceptable before access is granted. So moving on to the next requirement, which is in PCI DSS 321, which is requirement 8.4. It mentions about documenting and communicating the authentication policies as per the requirements. Now, this requirement has been addressed and moved to requirement 8.3.8 of the new PCI DSS 4. And this also mentions about authentication policies and procedures, and they have to be documented and communicated to all users. And this should include they've given 4 points, as you can see on the screen. Then moving on to the next requirement, which is requirement 8.5 of PCI 321. It says do not use group shared or generic password or any other authentication methods, as you can see below. So it's very particular about it. Now, this had a specific issue The issue was in some systems like Linux based systems, you cannot change the user ID. Admin remains admin. You cannot have a new user ID created. Windows might allow it, but then what will you do? In Unix based systems, or it could be some application which has got hard coded user IDs, then what will you do? So the shared administrative user IDs are mandatorily there. And this was really an issue with the older version. But now this is addressed in requirement 8.2.2 of the latest version PCI 4. And this requirement 8.2.2 has changed the focus to allow shared authentication credentials, but only on an exception basis. The exception has to be justifiable. And they are managed in a very effective manner, and they have given the 6 points for taking into consideration every time you allow a shared user ID to exist. So justification has to be there, applicability has to be there, explicit approval has to be there, and you have to find a way, the last part, which is the tricky, that is every action is attributable to an individual user. Now, with a shared user ID, that becomes very difficult, but you'll have to find a way to do it. You can use some third party, privileged account managing system, PIM or PAM systems and all, but you'll have to do it. And again, this is not applicable for single card POS terminals. So the next requirement under the older version was requirement 8.6, and this speaks about the authentication mechanisms and how they are used. For example, physical, logical, security tokens, smart cards, certificates, and how they are assigned. So there are the two, conditions for that, or two requirements for that. And now this requirement is now addressed, or rather moved, into 8.3.11 under the new PCI DSS 4. And now this speaks about authentication factors such as physical or logical security, tokens, smart cards, under requirement 8.3, that is. And here in the latest version of PCI DSS 4, it also mentions where authentication factors such as physical or logical security tokens, smart cards, or certificates are used. They should be done under, two specific conditions that is given. That is, factors are assigned to an individual user and not shared among multiple users. So as you know, for any of these token smart cards or all, there is something called as a factor, like a registration key or a serial code, or some sort of a key for each of these tokens which are unique. And so whatever the factors are, it should not be shared across multiple users. So I've literally seen that, sometimes there could be one user created, and they are shared across multiple actual users. You know how they do it? The password is there, they're shared across, say, three users. And the second factor in the authentication is multi-factor biometric. So for the first user, they have used the thumb registered, and for the second user, when it allows for multiple biometric codes. So for one user, thumb is used, then for the second user, other finger of the second user is used, and then for the third user, again, another finger is used. So these three people are able to log in using the same user ID, password, and multi-factor. So the factors cannot be assigned um, across multiple users. And then physical or logical users ensure only the intended user can use that factor to gain access. And in this thing, again, it's not forbidden, but in my personal opinion, that smart card doesn't really look good in case you're a security conscious organization. It's not allowed type, but anybody can share the smart card also and the password also with somebody else for authentication. So that becomes a problem. I hope you're getting what I'm saying. No, so the purpose of this requirement is that, see, if multiple users can use the authentication, such as tokens, smart cards, and certificates, then it may be impossible to identify which individual had used the authentication mechanism. The same thing. So I'm sharing the token with somebody else, or smart cards used across somebody else, or the same digital certificate installed on multiple machines. So it becomes impossible. So, the point is that organizations should not behave in such a cheap manner and try and behave in a more secure and mature manner. And the next requirement of the older version is requirement 8.7. which mentions about all access to any database containing cardholder data, which includes access by applications, administrators, and all the users to be restricted in this mannerism that you can see on the screen, the three mannerisms. Now this requirement is now moved in unto the requirement 7.2.6 of the latest PCI DSS 4, because there it aligns much better with the content requirement and requirement 7. Now, at this time, I cannot get into the requirement again. In case you would like to see what is requirement 7.2.6 and my explanation, you can click on the description in this description of this video, and the exact timeline is given over there. You can just jump to that timeline directly. And then finally, coming to the end of this elaboratedly long video, the requirement 8.8 of PCI 321. This mentions about ensuring, that the security policies and procedures for identification and authentication are documented in use and known to all affected parties, right? So this was the standard last requirement in PCI DSS 3.2.1. But in version 4, this has literally become the first one across all the requirements. So the same requirement 8.8 in 3.2.1 is now 8.1.1 in PCI 4. And here it speaks about effectively managing and maintaining all policies and procedures specified through requirement 8. And this speaks about these four things, that is, all the requirements are documented, kept up to date, in use, and known to all affected parties. Right. So now with this, we end our very informative session and very extended session on PCI requirement 8, the summary of changes from 3.2.1 to version 4. And I really hope that it really helps you in understanding the changes in this very crucial requirement and clears your doubts. In case you have any more doubts, drop it in the comment section below and I will respond to you. And so to look at the requirements changes in the other requirements 9, 10, 11, 12, do keep tuned in to our sessions. And in the next one, we'll be covering up requirement 9. And we also request all you, my users, to share this video and to share your valuable feedback. It could be, positive, it could be negative, all are welcome. So if you have any further queries, you can also write to me on askus@vistainfosec.com. You can see that email address in your scroll down below. All right. So thank you again. Have a wonderful day ahead. Take care. Bye bye.